Awesome. Well, I want to talk about the last mistake that guys make when they're fishing a jig, and it kind of is similar to the, using not using heavy enough jig, but this is probably the most common mistake of the five. This is the most common, and that's that guys don't actually let their jig get down to the bottom. So guys and gals they're casting their jig out, and it's just randomly out in the middle of the water column. And I see this happen so often. I actually have a graphic here, guys. Here's a little jig. I got a nice jig here, and this is what I see a lot of guys do when I'm on the lake with them. They'll let that jig hit the water. They'll engage their reel. They'll click their reel as soon as that jig hits the water, and then they'll just kind of let it fall. And what happens is because you engage your reel right when that bait hits the water, you have kind of a tight line, and that bait's going to pendulum. And it's going to pendulum and pendulum and pendulum. And then all of a sudden, you're going to wait like 10 seconds, and you're like, it's probably hit the bottom by now. And they start working it. And they're working it, and they're working it way over the fish in like 15 feet of water, over 20 foot of water. And that bait never hits the bottom once. And because that line is tight, they're just working their jig all the way back to the boat, just in the middle of the cover, and they're like, man, where's that brush pile? I can never find it. Where's the rock? And they never get their bait even close to the fish. So one of the biggest things you have to do when you fish a jig is whenever you cast that bait out there, whether it's pitching the jig, flipping the jig, you want to let that bait fall on a slack line. What that means is when that bait hits the water, you need to actually give the bait line, pull some line out of your reel. If you're in deeper water, you may have to pull out more line. And if you're in shallow water, less line. But you want that jig to fall on a slack line. The line is basically not tight. You want a loose line. And you want that thing to be loose so that that jig won't actually get pulled towards the boat. It'll fall straight down to the bottom. This will get that bait right down the bottom where the fish are. And then when you start dragging it, you're going to be in contact with that bottom. Once you're down there, you want to actually make sure that that jig is in contact with the bottom or the cover the entire casts. The only exception is when maybe you want to like rip the jig off the bottom and let it fall back down. That's called stroking a jig. But regardless, if you pop it up, you want to make sure it gets all the way back down to the bottom. And you'll know if that jig's down there and around the cover if you're throwing a heavy enough jig. If you're throwing a 5/8 to 3/4 ounce jig, you'll know that jig is down there in the bottom. And if you're struggling to make bottom contact, go to a heavier jig, even in shallow water, 3 to 10 foot of water. Go to a 3/4 ounce jig or a 5/8 ounce jig, because you'll guarantee that you'll be making bottom contact, and those fish don't necessarily care all that much a lot of times. If you have a heavier jig, sometimes it can maybe get you a few extra bites to go to a little bit lighter jig. But when you're learning jig fishing, I cannot stress enough the importance of going to a heavier jig to make sure that bait is making bottom contact, and also let that bait fall in a slack line. Give your bait line. It's almost like you're picking out a backlash. Every time it looks like that when I'm kind of fishing, you cast out, and it's not like you're picking out a backlash. You're just literally letting the line out so it falls in a slack line down. Would you agree with that, Randy?
Man, it was cracking me up when you were talking about that because I have seen anglers make that mistake so often. People that are learning about jigs or people that don't fish much. You're exactly right, and they'll throw it out there, and like I said, they just never get into the strike zone. And there's a couple different things on this. First of all, wind and current have a big part to play in that too, because everything that Jonny was talking about there it's multiplied tenfold by wind or current to make it even worse. So that is what everybody has to do when you first. I don't care if you're fishing an offshore, if you're fishing 30 foot deep, or if you're flipping bushes, or if you're flipping boat docks, you have got to peel that line out to get that bait to fall straight down there, because that not only puts that bait in the strike zone where it needs to be immediately, but that just increases your time in the sweet spot down there. And jig fishing, it's all about angle. It's all about generating strikes from the fall rate and angles. And you cannot pitch it out there and let it swing back on a tight line. That's one of the biggest mistakes I see, that like if you take, like a kid fishing, somebody like a 7 or 8 year old kid that doesn't know how to fish, that's what they do every time. So, and even I think good anglers are guilty of that a little bit. Yeah, you got to let that jig fall on the slack line. And but even though it's falling on a slack line, you really need to pay attention as that bait's falling, and it needs to be sort of on a controlled slack line. It's not like you just peel out a bunch of loose line and it's just falling and you don't know when it even hits the bottom. There's a combination of the slack line fall and aware of what that jig's doing at the same time. Because the thing that I found about jig fishing is that at least 75% of the time, the bass is going to bite that jig from the time it touches the bottom until you hop it one time. For me, most of the time, especially in a shallow water pitching and flipping situation, 25% of the time they'll get it after you've worked at 5 or 10 feet. But most of the time, if there's a good one there and you've made a cast in a high percentage sweet area, the bass is going to have that jig in its mouth almost as soon as it hits the bottom.
Yeah, and when Randy's talking about a controlled slack line, the way you do that basically is when you're feeding out your line most of the time is going to be sitting on top of the water at some point. There's a point where your line is entering the water. And so what you want to do is you want to watch where the line enters the water, and if that line is moving forward into the water, it means your jig is still falling. And so even though you're pulling out a bunch of slack line, when you pitch it out there and you let out slack, watch your line as it's falling in. And if you are in 10 foot of water and your jig stops after 2 seconds, it means that fish has probably already got the bait in its mouth, because it's usually going to fall for maybe 5 or 6 seconds. And that's when you can reel up all that slack and then set the hook on them. So that's how you kind of do that. Awesome. So those are the top 5 common mistakes. Guys, I want to talk about jig trailers. We got a bunch of other questions too, and we're going to get to all those. Just to recap these, and then we'll get into jig trailers and questions. The top 5 most common jig fishing mistakes are not fishing a specific target, fishing under the wrong conditions, fishing a jig that is too light, so not heavy enough, missing the bite, and not letting the bait get to the bottom. Those are basically your 5 common mistakes. And if you want to recap that, you can watch the video back on YouTube afterwards, or download the Fish Moment podcast through the Apple and Spotify podcast apps, so you can actually listen to the podcast there. So let's talk a little bit about trailers. I know what trailers you throw, Randy, and I don't have that big of a preference. I basically throw a Strike King Menace Grub, a Strike King Rage Craw, and a big salty chunk zoom trailer. So I like the big salty chunk trailer here. And then if we go to the Strike King real quick, I throw a Strike King Rage Craw. Everyone knows what a Rage Craw is, and a Strike King regular size Menace Grub. I throw the Menace Grub when I'm in colder water, let's say less than 60-degree water temperature, and I throw the Rage Craw when I am fishing in warmer water, so above 60-degree water. And I'll throw that big salty chunk, this one right here, when I want a slower fall and when I want a bigger kind of meatier bite. It's usually when that water temperature is below 45 degrees, I'll go to this. Or if I'm like flipping in the summer and I want a slower fall rate. But those are really my 3 trailers. I'm actually working on a trailer with Jewel right now, Randy, that we're going to be putting out, and it's going to be the ultimate jig trailer. It kind of takes a combination of all these different trailers. It's going to be one of the most versatile jig trailers in the market, and it's coming out sometime here in like middle of the spring, late spring, something like that. So be on the lookout for that. But what jig trailers would you recommend? I have a Tackle Warehouse pulled up here, Randy, so I can show them while you're recommending.
Well, for me, I know, Jonny fishes. When he's fishing jigs, he's fishing football head most of the time.
Yeah.
I'm guessing, out of your jig fishing, you probably do 80% football head jig fishing in the course of a year with the offshore fishing you do.
Yeah.
For me, the opposite. When I'm fishing a jig, 80 to 90% of the time, I'm flipping and pitching it around some type of shallow cover, whether it be, docks, rocks, wood, bushes, that type of stuff. So our jig fishing techniques are different as far as mine and Johnny's go. So for me, I know a lot of people have gotten into the jig trailers that have the curly tails, like the Rage Craws or the Speed Craws, that type of stuff. For me, I like the chunk type trailers better. I like the Zoom, either the Super Chunk Junior, or the Big Salty Chunk. Those are my 3 go-to jig trailers. I know a lot of guys like the master jig fisherman like Randall Tharp. I mean, that's the same type of trailers he throws a lot. But then you got some of the guys like Hackney that like the Rage Craws. So a lot of it is just a matter of your personal preference. To me, the jig trailer that you do has a lot to do with how you want the jig profile to look, because a jig profile will alter. I mean, a jig trailer will alter the profile and the fall tremendously of the jig. So that's all considerations you have to make based upon water clarity, water temperature, the size of fish you're catching, the time of the year, the type of cover you're fishing. There's a lot of variables that go into it, but I'm going to guess that for me, probably 75% of the time, I'm using the Big Salty Chunk or the Zoom Super Chunk on my jigs.
Good stuff. I know you just made a video recently about the old Uncle Josh pork frogs. They're coming back. I used to actually, the guys from Uncle Josh, they were up in Wisconsin, and so I feel like an idiot now. I knew all the guys from Uncle Josh. I went fishing with them all the time up there, and they basically said, we'll give you an unlimited supply of any Uncle Josh product you want. They were just giving me the stuff whatever I wanted, and I was like, oh, pork, it's gross. It was annoying. I like plastic better, and I didn't take any of it. I was like, I'm never going to use it. You guys just keep it. I don't care. And man, I could have made a killing off of all the pork I could have sold. They were going to give me like cases of pork, and I didn't take it.
It's
So,
selling
shame
for
on
like
me.
$15 a jar now if you can get it. I tell you how big of a pork fan I was. I used to have in for 15 years I would carry plastic Tupperware bowls. Like I'm talking about this big, like big plastic Tupperware bowls. I'd have one of them full of blue ones, one of them full of brown ones, one of them full of black ones. I'd have like 100 pork frogs in each one of these big Tupperware things, and I'd carry them with me to the tournaments. That's how much I used to use pork. I was really bummed out when they quit making it.
That's hilarious. It sounds like also a lot of guys are wanting to know about pork or about the different trailers, Randy, for different water temperatures. That might be some YouTube content for you. Randy has some awesome tackle tips and stuff on his channel, Intuitive Angling with Randy Blockett. So maybe that's some videos that come up here soon, Randy.
Yeah, I mean, jig fishing, I mean, that people don't realize how many variables are involved in jig fishing. I mean, it's literally, you know, it's probably the most complex as far as the different options that you have of any lure category out there. You know, in my opinion, jerkbait fishing is the most complicated technique, but jig fishing is the one that has the most variables to the bait itself because there's so many different combinations. You got your size, your colors, your skirt material, the trailer combinations, everything that goes with it. It's just it would take a book to cover everything, a thick book.
Oh yeah, for sure. Awesome. Well, we have a bunch of questions, so really great questions about tungsten versus lead and a bunch of other stuff. And we're going to get into all those, but really quick, I just want that is at that for that. Oh, also check out the lake breakdowns, by the way, too. All of our lake breakdowns, 40 GPS waypoints, detailed area descriptions. We also have personal lake breakdowns available from Randy, who will look at any lake in the country, even if we don't have it marked here, and he'll give you 40 GPS waypoints that go straight in your fish finder with instructions on how to do that. So all of that. So let's jump back over here to questions. One question we got, and I think it was from... I don't want to steal the credits here, but I think it was from Steven. I'm trying to find the question here. It's basically, what are our thoughts about tungsten versus lead, both for jigs? I think it's just the tungsten versus lead for jigs. What are your thoughts there? Have you ever thrown a tungsten jig, Randy?
I've never fished a tungsten jig. I fish tungsten sinkers on my, on soft plastics all the time. But to me, tungsten is a superior material. I mean, I don't think anybody has really came out with an affordable line of tungsten jigs that I'm aware of. But anytime you're dealing with a smaller profile, that's a good thing. So I'm all for tungsten, absolutely.
Yeah, and that was Ryan Williams. Yeah, if tungsten wasn't so dang expensive, I would throw a tungsten jig as well. That's why we kind of designed the Fish Moment offshore jig with the lead poured down the shank of the hook. It makes the head smaller, which helps it come through cover. So if you could then pour that lead down the shank of the hook and then make the head even smaller than that while still keeping the weighting right, that would even be better. So I think a tungsten jig would be great. It's just cost wise. I mean, I'm throwing a jig in the middle of brush piles and stuff. You're going to break off eventually. So I think it's just probably not as cost effective. I'd rather spend my money on other stuff, I guess, than tungsten jigs, put it that way. Okay, so that was that question. Next question. Do you downsize fishing spotted bass? That's from Ira. I honestly, the thing I do with my jigs is I don't downsize the weight of the jig. I'll still throw my 5/8 or 3/4 ounce jig. I just trim up the skirt. So I'll make the skirt a lot shorter and I'll go to a smaller trailer for spotted bass as opposed to downsizing the weight of the jig. Would you agree there, Randy?
Yeah, for me, I mean, that's a great question too. For me, it depends on the species of spotted bass that I'm fishing. I have found out that the Alabama spotted bass, that's on the Coosa River and all the Alabama lakes down there, they will bite a big jig. They'll bite a big jig the same way as a largemouth bass will. But if you're fishing more of the traditional Kentuckies, the spotted bass from the Ozarks, the spotted bass like in some of the Georgia lakes over there, they prefer a more downsized profile. But so that's sort of the two scenarios I've seen unfold with it. That tournament that we just got done, our last Bassmaster Open we had there at Lay Lake. I mean, I was fishing a full size jig with the Zoom Super Chunk on it, and every fish I weighed in was a spotted bass on a full size giant jig.
Awesome. Yeah, I don't think it matters all that much other than, with if they can get the bait in their mouth, that's all that matters. Another question from Ira, another good question. In cold water, are you dragging the jig super slow, like crawling it, maintaining contact with the bottom of the cover the whole time? Yeah, so Ira, I'm maintaining bottom contact all the time in any season, regardless of the water temperature. One thing I'll say is that I fish a jig pretty fast. If you watch me fish a football jig, I cast that thing out there, I let it hit the bottom, and I'm dragging it like drag, stop, drag, stop. I mean, I'm moving that thing pretty quick. I'm not necessarily fishing my jig slow in the summer. So when I'm fishing it in the winter, I'm probably fishing my jig in the winter the same speed that you guys are fishing your jigs in the summer, which means you're probably casting your jig out, letting it sink to the bottom, hopping it a few times, letting it sit for 2 or 3 seconds, moving it a few feet, letting it sit for a few seconds. That's like my wintertime retrieve. My summer and like warmer weather retrieve, basically anytime the water is above 60 degrees, I'm firing that thing out there, letting it hit the bottom, and I am dragging it maybe 5 to 10 feet at a time, maybe even more, and then pausing it, moving it, pausing it. I'm moving it quite a bit. I'm not trying to soak that bait in an area. My thoughts, whenever I get a lot of my jig bites, that fish will bite it as soon as that bait comes in contact with the bottom. And the other time they bite it is right after I make that big pull and it stops. That's when they bite it. And I think that fishing that jig faster and moving it further makes it act like a fleeing crawfish. And that quick movement where it moves away from quickly, that's what triggers the bites. And I've been seeing that a lot actually on the live scope. Even in super cold water, when you think those fish are going to be lethargic, they'll still chase a bait up and down the water column and moving fast and stuff like that, no problem, even in super cold water. I mean, I've seen fish in Wisconsin blow up on a frog through thin sheets of ice in the middle of the winter. So a fish will eat a frog through a thin sheet of ice in the middle of the winter with frozen water. They will eat a jig fished at a decent pace. Would you agree there, Andy?
Yeah, no doubt. And that's that question is it's relative to what you consider cold water and what the visibility of that water is in. The colder, the dirtier water, the less I'm hopping it, the more I'm dragging it, and it gets a little bit higher hops and a little bit faster drag as the water gets cleaner and warmer.
Yep. Yep. Let's see here. Trying to find some more questions. What's the jig that you've caught the most fish on over your lifetime, Randy?
For me, it's been that lunker lure, the Rattling lunker lure jig. I used to be sponsored by lunker lure. I'm not anymore, but I was for about a decade. And I've caught more bass on that jig flipping than I have any other jig out there for sure.
And you like that Rattling jig?
Yeah, I like the lunker lure rattleback jig. It's the one that Tommy Biffle used to use constantly. He's the one that made it famous. And I just, Denny Brower actually used to use that jig too. And, it's one I've used and still use a lot.
And when do you go to a rattle versus not a rattle when flipping?
I like a rattle most all the time in my jig fishing, unless I'm fishing super clear water with finesse trailers, like, down rocky bluffs, rocky banks, that type of stuff. But anytime my jig is like over something or around some type of an isolated target, I think that will help on a jig. It's because it's real subtle. It's not a rattle on a jig is not like a rattle on a crankbait or anything like that. It's more of it's almost like the noise that a crawdad would make, just scurrying along the bottom. So I've never seen it, be a negative. I prefer it actually.
Awesome. Yeah, I've put jigs in or rattles in my jigs when I'm fishing offshore, and I mean I haven't seen any change in the results. The Fish Moment offshore jig actually has a rattle band collar, so you can add a rattle to that jig, and I do it sometimes, but like I don't know. For me, offshore, it doesn't really make that big of a difference. I can see it making a difference up shallow, though, flipping. Again, the only time I ever flip a jig is when I'm throwing a 1 ounce jig. And I think with a 1 ounce jig, it doesn't matter. Those fish are just biting it because it's flying past their face at 500 miles an hour. So that's the reason they bite it. But that's my type of flipping, anyways. I don't know how you flip all the time, Randy. It's to me, it's like the most boring technique in the entire world. Just randomly, just going down the bank. I can't do it.
It's boring until you get 4 or 5 pounder on it. But I can remember back, if you guys can ever get a chance to watch some of the old Bassmaster of Tommy Biffle back in the early '90s, that's all that dude used to fish. I mean, you'd see him with his lunker lure rattleback jig, and he'd have his salt craw, and he'd bite part of the salt craw off, and that's what he'd fish all the time. And he proved it to me because, man, he was a dominating force during that time frame on that rattling jig.
That's awesome. John says he caught his first bass of 2021 Sunday with the Fish Moment offshore jig, a 3-pounder. That's what I'm talking about. Good stuff right there. So, awesome. That's it for us, guys. Randy, anything else to add on jig fishing before we sign off?
Man, just learn it, guys. Like I said, I know a lot of people, they're hesitant to get in jig fishing. It's a big commitment to learn all the different jig fishing techniques. And I hear a lot of people that fish plastic worms a lot. They think that it's a big leap to go to a jig.
Yeah.
But actually, if you can fish a plastic worm and you know what a bite feels like on a plastic worm, you'll be a really good jig angler. And it will definitely increase the average size of your fish. So, I would highly suggest everybody make a commitment to becoming a better jig angler.
For sure. And guys, if you enjoyed this live stream or if you've been watching this YouTube video all the way to this point, definitely leave a like down this video. It helps out the algorithm on the YouTube video so much. Every video, if you can just leave a like, it like doubles the views practically on the videos if everyone just leaves a like. So leave a like down this live stream. Just go and hit the thumbs up button down below. It would help us out so much. And YouTube, the algorithm is so weird that we appreciate any help we can get there. And also subscribe to Fish the Moment if you want to get notified of all of our upcoming live streams. We do them every single Tuesday. We also post these live streams as well as our Fish the Moment YouTube content to the Fish the Moment podcast on the Apple and the Spotify app. So just go to Fish the Moment podcast on there and you can listen to all of the audio from these clips and maybe re-listen to it on the way to the lake if you felt like it was just too much information to consume at one time. So really appreciate everyone watching. We appreciate all the support. The support on Patreon has been amazing this month, on the website. Thank you guys for helping us continue to put out great content, spend our time fishing and teaching you guys as much as we can, and also learning, like I kind of did today, about the live scope. So, Randy, excited to kick off 2021, and should be a great year for fishing, and best of luck everyone on the water. See you guys later. Have a good night.